Thank you very much indeed, and welcome to Frontline Club. It's a great privilege to be back here again. All of you in the room are used to the fact we have a great quality of speakers at the Frontline, and tonight is no exception. I'm privileged to be chairing. I guess as so often is the role of the chair, actually have enormously little knowledge. The knowledge is surrounding me. In as much as I do, it's revolutions in general that I've followed over the years, and was the co-author of a book last year about revolutions and mischief, and if you're rather happy that's now coming out in Arabic for understandable reasons, and from Amnesty International, which obviously has a strong interest, to put it mildly, in all of these different issues, and there's a report incidentally coming out later tonight, and for journalists in the audience, happy to give copies of that, of one which will be coming out tonight or tomorrow. But more to the point, let me go straight to our distinguished panel, starting in order of those who will be speaking. I'm asking to speak a little bit to start with, and then a discussion, then obviously, and crucially, throwing it open for discussion with you guys. First of all, on my far left, Rosemary Hollis, who many of you will know, enormously distinguished observer of Middle Eastern affairs over the years, both at the Royal United Service Institute, then at Chatham House, many years Middle East director there, and also research director, and now responsible for the Olive Tree program at City University, still working on Middle Eastern issues, has followed the region very, very closely, and will, I know, have lots of very interesting things to say. Maha Azam, also from Chatham House, still at Chatham House, where Rosemary has moved elsewhere. Maha Azam, herself Egyptian-born, has remained very much in touch with Egypt, but at Chatham House has been, again, looking at Egypt, but also looking across the region at analysing what has happened, and I know we'll have a lot of interesting things to tell us also. Brian Whittaker, whose work many of you in the room will know, many years as Middle East editor at The Guardian, now editor of Comment is Free, and I suspect continuing with a Middle Eastern interest while focusing there, and again has written fascinating stuff over the years, including
What's Really Wrong with the Middle East?
That was written before, it must be said. We'll be discussing tonight also what is still wrong, but a lot of the things in that book addressing why is it that you might have some restive problems coming up in due course. And last, but very much not least, Khalid Abdallah, actor who many of you will have seen in a number of films, from Kite Runner to United 93 and others, but crucially also for the purposes of this evening's conversation, born of Egyptian parents, born in Britain of Egyptian parents, has remained, again, interested, engaged with the country, but also has been there himself in recent months, was there in Tahrir, was filming and was involved with projects which I hope he will talk about a little more, of bringing video to the streets, and I hope we'll hear a little bit more about his filming projects. I forgot to say that Maha also, so Khalid is absolutely fresh back, just last week, last week. Yeah. And I don't think I'm betraying secrets if I say that apart from the wonderfulness of coming to this Frontline event this evening, he also has a small personal event coming up this Saturday, which, so congratulations on.
I'm getting married.
An upcoming wedding. So Frontline and an upcoming wedding. What more could be better? Starting there, I'd like to start with a very open question. The question put before us this evening is, can Tunisians and Egyptians reclaim their revolutions? I guess the nature of that title already suggests that things have gone badly wrong. And during a brief visit to Cairo a couple of months ago, I was struck by the fact that after all the excitement of Tahrir Square, it kind of felt almost as though it was difficult to find a more pessimistic place than being in Cairo. And the newly arrived foreigner kept saying, yes, but surely you must be pleased about this. And people would say, no, you have to understand how great the problems are. And they are, of course, right, the problems are huge. I have to say, I myself, as having worked on Eastern Europe for many, many years, have kind of felt I'd heard some of that pessimism before. But I'm interested here from our speakers, how great is the challenge that still faces us? And I suppose, put differently, was there too much optimism around in all the reporting and the thinking and the millions of words that were spoken and written at the beginning of this year? Was there too much optimism then in thinking, great, we now have bright sunny uplands, everything is going to be fine from now onwards? And or Are we now facing too much of a backlash of pessimism, thinking it's all going wrong? How great the challenge is, what needs to be done in order for things to move forward? And also, because we keep talking about the Arab Spring and the countries as a collective, but of course we're talking about very, very different countries here as well. And so it'd be interesting to hear how much you see contrasts or similarities between the cases of Tunisia and Egypt, which are discussing. We're not discussing Syria and Libya today, although that may creep into the conversation also, I suspect. But fundamentally looking at those which we've stopped talking about so much. Rosemary, can you start us off with a few of your thoughts?
Yes, thank you very much. May I just make one observation about where I'm coming from to this, because I work on the international politics of the region, the involvement of the Europeans and the British in particular over the last 100 years. And latterly the Americans, and the mix of the foreigners and the locals. I'm not a traditional classical Arabist or student of the Middle East per se. And I believe that if you look at our history over the centuries, literally centuries, we got here together. And the interactions between people around the Mediterranean are the norm. And not the exception, and the Middle East and North Africa are not somewhere very foreign and over there and a part of the world that in Europe and Britain in particular we've had little to do with. Latterly the Americans are the regional hegemon, or became, they're declining now. So I'm seeing things in that mix, and I've experienced these revolutions with great enthusiasm because I too was beginning to feel anxious that any people could endure such dictatorship, and was inspired by the way the Tunisian and Egyptian revolutions erupted. I don't like the term Arab Spring because I think it implies Europe and not Arab experience. And I think it's very revolutionary what's happening. But I also think it's in the nature of things that the aspirations of those revolting will be across a whole spectrum. And so, yes, some are going to be desperately disappointed. Part of my summer was in the region, but at the other part of the region, the conflict zone of Israelis and Palestinians and Jordanians, and I noticed that in Jordan the aspirations can be divided into two in terms of reform and change. You have those who believe that there should be more help for the poor, more patronage from the top to help the poor, be it with subsidies or breaks into education or jobs, versus the young, entrepreneurial, go-getting, internet-savvy generation who want an opening up in a sense that involves politics, debate, freedom of expression, and holding ministers accountable. And that those two sets of desires are not easily reconciled. Another point that I want to make, and I think it will be emphasized a bit later with those who know Egypt in particular very well, doing some research in Egypt 4 years ago, I was being told by a lot of Egyptian intellectuals that the situation is seething, Mubarak can't live forever, and when he goes, that's going to be a potential explosion point. And there was much debate about whether the army would tolerate Gamal, his son, as a replacement. And it was at that stage 4 years ago that I learnt that the army was part of the fabric of society in a way that could be respected by the people, and that the president and his son or sons had got separated in their mind from the national good, and that this greed and the disconnect between the mass and the very, very rich elite was a fundamental problem. Now, the other thing that I want to say that I learned about Egypt is the perception was that everything is forbidden except what is permitted by the law. So it was almost impossible to live in Egypt without breaking the law, and the government would only come get you when you broke the law in political terms. Now, discussing with Egyptians, how do you reform a system like that? The only way is a revolution, because so much has got to be changed. You can't tinker with bits of it. Just to conclude, to bring together those two thoughts about the legal structures, never mind elections, never mind the choosing of politicians, without attention to the legal structures, what the laws are that are being upheld in the courts and enforced by the police and the security services and protected by the state, is crucial, it seems to me, and that is a bigger challenge to change in a way than just introducing elections. And the other is this business of the aspirations of people for more, or for more equality, less inequality, less egregious, outrageous greed and opulence. So I think it's going to be in the money. And I think magnanimity doesn't long survive the maintenance of privilege, just a swapping of the elites, as we've seen in Iran. And so I'm worried about the money, where it's coming from and how it's being distributed, and I'm worried about the law. And I don't think it's in the power of any single group to put those things right. So the future will be beautiful if there's more rather than less cooperation amongst the people.
Thank you very much. Maha Rosemary talked about saying all of these entrenched things, that only a revolution can change that, and talked about the swapping of elites, which is clearly a great fear of what is happening. It's clear, I think, to all of us that at least part of a revolution happened, and it was pretty dramatic and pretty inspiring. But do you think that we have had a revolution, or is it only half a revolution? And do you think it's moving towards completion? And we may come to this later or not, but certainly one bit that I'm interested in is elections which are upcoming. Do they help bed down the revolution, in other words, bed down changes because of people's choices, or on the contrary, do you think they the greater danger is that they entrench the difficulties that Rosemary's already? And sorry, in Tunisia, of course, I've been to as well. Yeah.
I think we've lived a revolutionary experience in Egypt and Tunisia, and are living it in Syria and elsewhere in the region. Insofar as a very entrenched political system has been challenged, and its head, the head of state, has been forced to step down. In the case of Tunisia, run away. In the case of Egypt, step down. That is fundamental. That's a fundamental change. In countries where dictatorships have survived for decades. And the dictatorship, for example, in Egypt is not just the dictatorship of President Mubarak that stepped down, it's a dictatorship of the military that existed since 1952. So we had President Nasser, followed by President Sadat, then by Mubarak. And I think it's something that's often, people are aware of it, but it's sort of not emphasized enough. The experience of dictatorship has been a very long one. Generations have lived and died under different dictatorships and fought wars, the 67 war, 73 war, and they're not with us now. They may have opposed these regimes and never saw this day. So it's a revolution in the making. It could be a partial revolution insofar as it can be a revolution that opens the door towards free and fair elections, and that in itself is an enormous change in terms of the lives of people throughout the region. It'll hold those in power accountable. It'll allow for political participation. And not calling that a revolution, I find difficult. However, it's then open to question what your vision of a society and a state is. Whether you want free and fair elections, but ultimately you allow the dominance of a similar elite to the one that was in power previously, in terms of economic elites and the power that they have in Egypt or Tunisia and the business interests that ensued for decades, that ultimately these elites still lurk in the background and maybe not so far in the background, and that they will re-emerge within the democratic process to dominate again. And that is a danger. If you have that and you don't have the addressing of issues to do with economic redistribution to some extent of wealth, of rejigging the whole educational and health structures and so on in these countries and providing for the mass of people, then you have something of an incomplete revolution. You have dislodged an authoritarian system and you've replaced it by a democratic one. But at the grassroots in countries like Egypt, where 40% of the population live on less than $2 a day, if you don't address the serious economic issues in countries like that, it is open to question whether really you have created a really very different society on an economic level. That you've created political channels for opposition, that perhaps you will be able to re-establish the rule of law, that the judiciary will have the place that it deserves in a democratic society, and people can turn to the courts and so on for redress of injustice and so on. That will be a very, very major step. And Egypt and Tunisia are going down that path. And therefore, these are great advances. And as an Egyptian myself, I am optimistic. But I'm also very much aware of the challenges. And again, we're going to probably address this later, but to touch on challenges beyond the economic ones, people often speak of the lack of institutions in these countries. I'd like to stress the fact that one of the major challenges is the strength of certain institutions that stand in the way of democratization, and that is the military, particularly in a country like Egypt, where the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces is now at the helm, leading the transition period towards the transitional phase towards elections supposedly to be held in November. Now, the military have been the backbone of dictatorship in Egypt, and in a sense they came to realize, like the United States and others, that President Mubarak was becoming an increasing liability. They didn't want, as Rosemary has said, didn't like the idea that Jamal, his son, would take over. And therefore it was seen, given the eruption of protests and so on, that they were going to allow this change within limits to take place. Now, to what extent are they going to remain on the scene? To what extent will the military want to maintain its interests, economic and other, in that society? I think over time the military itself will be challenged, as it's increasingly being challenged in Egypt today. The first steps have already been taken. I think once you've broken the barrier of fear, as has happened in Egypt and Tunisia, even those institutional bulwarks in society can be challenged and will down the line be challenged. Turkey is often posited as an example of where the military maintained its power for many decades, but ultimately today it's a much weaker institution. There are similarities and great differences between the Egyptian military and the Turkish military. However, the Egyptian military over time will not be challenged just by the youth, but I think by Egyptian society as a whole. its turn will come in the same way that Mr. Mubarak now is on trial, and again we can discuss the kind of trial. I think there will be a time when people will say we also want to hold accountable those elements of the upper echelons of the military that have supported dictatorship for so long. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Brian, as one who has watched the countries over many years, watched and written and visiting them, now seeing it more from a distance, what's the sense that you have of what is needed in order to take the title of the evening to reclaim the revolutions? Or do you feel they're not really lost? And perhaps coming out of that, do you agree that there has been a media question, really, a change of narrative, that overwhelmingly the pieces written in the first 2-3 months of this year were very, very optimistic of what could be changed, even though many who knew the area best said, yes, but there will be this list of challenges coming? And is there a media thing that once you've done all the upbeat stories, at that point you turn around and you do lots of the downbeat ones, and that neither quite reflect, as it were? So
that's basically how it works, right, with the media. Yeah, I mean, I think really you have to take a long view of this, and I mean long, 20 years, 30 years perhaps. If we go back to the early 2000s and the Bush administration, they saw regime change as the sort of beginning and end of everything, certainly in Iraq. And really that was wrong. Regime change is important. It opens up possibilities for other things, but if you compare the Ben Ali regime, say in Tunisia, with what is going to be elected in October, people are going to say, well, it's an improvement, perhaps not that much of an improvement. But I think we have to look at really what the, and again I disagree, I agree with Rosemary about not liking Arab Spring very much. I've tried Arab Awakening, but I'm told that's a sort of Islamic term. Which,
a new one. Oh, I see.
Arab Dawn, I don't know. Anyway, the point is, I think you look at the slogans that people have used, obviously wanting the fall of the regime, execute the president, as they're now saying in Syria. But also, you don't see the word democracy used very much at all. People talk about things like respect and dignity. And what I see in this, actually, what I think it's all about, is people reclaiming their citizenship. It's about the empowerment of people. It's about people discovering new possibilities. And it's about a new kind of relationship between governments and the governed. And that I think is what the region is now working towards. So the ups and downs of new regimes, elections and things, I think are sort of steps along the way, but it's not really what this is all about. I suppose the other thing to say is that, looking back to one of the TV broadcasts that Ben Ali made when he was fighting to keep his presidential palace, he promised to create tens of thousands of new jobs within the next 12 months or 2 years or whatever it was. Of course, he was too busy trying to suppress the demonstrations to do any of that himself. And since he's gone, as far as I can tell, nothing has been done either. So we're actually still left, despite all the politics, we're still left with an economic situation in Tunisia which is really no better than it was before, and perhaps slightly worse. If you look at Yemen, it's probably considerably worse. Again, in Egypt, there are economic expectations which have been raised, which I don't think there's much hope of fulfilling. And possibly the only one where they could be fulfilled would be Libya, where there's a reasonable amount of oil which could be distributed to do that sort of thing. I suppose the other thing to talk about is where religion fits into all this. It seems to be the case at the moment that the Islamist parties in both Tunisia and Egypt are hovering around, I guess, the 20 to 30% margin in polls at the moment. My feeling is that they will be influential players in the future, but not dominant. And in a way, I think that's quite a good thing, because what we've had up to now is the Islamists have really had quite an easy ride under Mubarak, particularly because although they were sort of suppressed, they were never really sort of challenged to justify their positions on quite lots of things, you know, like the treatment of Christians and things. And I think what will happen now is that they will have to basically grapple with reality, and by entering politics openly, and they're going to be challenged. I'll stop there for now.
Thank you. Khalid, you bring up a particular perspective. I mean, I think that it would be interesting to hear from you in general your thoughts of where Egypt especially is going. I mean, I'm interested to hear on Tunisia, but Egypt, which I think you spent most of this year there, really, basically, haven't you, apart from
well, most of the last 3 years. Yeah.
Okay, right. So have seen the whole thing through. Interested in your sense from the ground of both popular optimism or pessimism, but also yours personally, and how much you feel that's out of kilter with those you're speaking to. And certainly I personally, and I suspect many in the room, would be extremely interested to hear the role of Mosserian and the work that you've been doing, and how that can play into that reclaiming of the revolution, or put differently, if it hasn't been lost, the sense of moving things forward and moving society forward as it changes. So, interested in your thoughts on any of that.
It's a lot. Well, yeah. I mean, I think the first thing to say is that I come from a different perspective. Certainly, I think in relation to a lot of these questions, and in my experience as a protester and as an activist and as someone close to many of the biggest activist issues in terms of the groupings and so on. And I kind of want, in some ways, first of all, to go back to the first question you posited in relation to, were we too optimistic and are we too pessimistic now, and kind of again question the formulation of the question in a way, or rather my perspective is that right on, it would have been a horrendous sin to be too optimistic, in the sense that in the sense that it is the optimism, it is the sense of possibility of change, it is that energy which creates the possibility of continuing, of continuing to make the revolution happen. Certainly, I think if you take a cold analytical perspective in relation to what's happened and what's happened so far, we do not have a full revolution, and that is a very clear revolutionary perspective, in that we still have the army in place. It's very clear, you know, the army's relationship, exactly as Maha was saying, you know, the army's relationship with former regime, the economic situation, all of those things in terms of what can be expected and the speed of change and all of those things. Where we are right now is we just had a month-long sit-in in Cairo, and I can only really speak about Egypt. I can't really speak about Tunisia. We just had a month-long sit-in in Cairo and in Egypt. There were in other places. It was the first sit-in very clearly pitted against the army, which is a landmark. It was then violently cleared at the beginning of this month, on the first day of Ramadan, which in itself is a sign of things. I would say that right now we are kind of we're in a very liminal period. We're in between, in terms of a revolution, in terms of the revolutionary spirit, the ability to go down into the streets in huge numbers, to force sweeping change, to believe that that is possible right now. We're in a hiatus. Right now as well, we're in the summer, it's hot, we've had Ramadan. There is a confusion right now amongst activists and people who are working to make change as to right now, do we begin to focus on elections, or do we still focus on many of the important human rights issues like military trials, like freedom of speech, all of those kinds of things. And the army right now is without a doubt on top and in the driving seat. You have a battle of discourses. You have a battle of, right now there's a battle of discourses as to what the situation is, as to who to follow, as to what to concentrate on, and that in itself as something which confuses people in terms of what to focus on, limits the possibility of sweeping change, because you can't twist someone's arm when you want to. So I mean, that's where I would say where we are right now. But again, and if I can use a kind of, I mean, it's not. I am extremely optimistic, and I'm also optimistic because I have to be optimistic. But that again, that doesn't negate my sense of the challenges ahead. But I believe that the optimism is greater than is sort of greater than those challenges. What we have here, as well in terms of the event itself, it's about a generation which will as well give birth to another generation, and you can very much feel that. It's just a fact of the experience. But how you look at the situation as to, and this is a really central issue, I think, even from an analytical point of view and from a political point of view and from an activist point of view, if that's separate. Do you look at things in terms of what it is right now? Or do you look at it in terms of what it is over the next 6 months? And over the next 6 months, we're supposed to have elections in November. It's not clear if we're going to have elections in November. The closer it gets to November and the closer we feel like we don't have elections, the closer it gets to January and it feels like things are not going at all as we expect them to, the more the possibility of a conflagration comes. And we've had that experience already. The last major sit-in was in March. It was in last March, and it was violently cleared, and it took us from March to July to get people angry enough again to come out on the streets. There's a demonstration which has a lot of popular support, which will be happening on the 9th of September. So, I mean, I think over the next 6 months, it's likely that we do see, I mean, depending on how the army plays it, but it's a very, and this is the kind of issue on a broad perspective. I mean, yes, in order to make the changes that satisfy the revolution's demands, we need massive economic change, and that is going to take one hell of a long time. And I think people know that. I don't think they're naive to it. We are going to need to deal with the issue of the army, and however much people, on the whole, I would say in relation to that issue, people's senses know when to pick your battles, and the overwhelming majority feel that that's a battle that they're going to have to play later, and the more hot-headed, of which I count myself, feel that no, there needs to be a consistent. Now is the time to consistently break down barriers, to break down taboos, to put things into question, to create, to set agendas. Not in the sense that they use it, because obviously everyone's accused of being foreign spies and agendas and all that kind of thing. But to set the parameters for discussion. all of and to change the and to work on the institutions. And it's extreme. It's very clear that all of those things are going to take a very long time, and I think everyone knows that. The question is, in relation to, and you know, we don't. I mean, crystal ball gazing is fun, actually. In the next year, I would say it's likely to. Personally, this is how I feel. I think it's likely to settle on something not so far from what the it's likely to settle on Amr Musa or something like that. The army is likely to maintain a place. The Muslim Brotherhood are likely to have their 20-30%. You know, that's the sort of rough shape. They're going to have to deal with these burning issues. And they're going to have to try and satisfy many of these, the sense of idealism. They're not going to, is what the panel is saying, basically. Now, if they're not going to, and they're also close to what and they have a closeness to the former regime, and you have all of those kinds of issues, you have the revolutionary forces, if you like, whether they're revolutionary or whether they become reformist or whatever they end up doing, they have, their issues have a kind of, their issues have a clarity. That's how I see it. And I see that over the next 5 to 10 years, the issues that we've fought for, and I saw people die for, have there are clarity over what to discuss and what needs to change and who needs to go and all of those kinds of things. So that's what gives me the optimism. But I think but I have to go back to this issue as to how we kind of frame the questions as to whether we should be optimistic or whether we should be pessimistic. And go back to it and say that it's a duty to be. I very strongly feel this because the optimism is. The optimism is the optimism is what's changed here. That's what's changed here. That people now. I mean, before the revolution, and this is what is horrendous about corruption, is that it corrupts your soul. It corrupts your sense of what you can and can't do, and whether it's worth even trying. And that will feed into issues of economics. It will feed into issues of what, the reformist energies that we can't identify right now inside institutions, inside all of those things. So it's an issue really of whether that has the chance to live.
It's a powerful set of statements, and you talked, and I think I don't misquote you in saying when you talked about breaking down barriers and breaking down taboos, you felt that energy was still there. As I mentioned earlier, when I was there in Cairo just before the re-eruption of the big protests, I was struck talking to activist colleagues there of how rather depressed they often felt. They felt there wasn't the energy which, as you say, is needed, but perhaps wasn't there. In a sense, I don't need persuading. I'm what I call sometimes a pathological optimist. And indeed, the book that I wrote was kind of about how you can change, and if you believe you can't, you won't, and if you believe that you can, that you will. So I agree with you very much in spirit on that. But Maha, I'm interested if do you share that view that indeed the energy, assuming I'm not misquoting, I don't think I am, that the energy to break down the barriers is still there, and that we're kind of on a track onward, and the elections, as you say, it's still very unclear, but do you have a sense of that bringing a kind of a greater clarity and a greater bedding down?
Again, I think primarily with reference to Egypt, but I think some of the things I'll say may also apply to Tunisia. I think it's a mixed picture. I agree totally that optimism and energy is fundamental in order to carry through change or to bring about a revolution. You can't have it without it. You have to have that spirit of, being optimistic and punching above your weight. And in a sense, the street in Egypt and the activists made up of youth and different elements of society that came to Tahrir, but also I think important to remember that the protests happened throughout Egypt. It wasn't just Tahrir. From Ismailia to Alexandria to different governments, and it's very, very important to be aware of this. This was a country where throughout the country there were people that were ready to protest against a political system that had been in place for a very long time. That involved courage, it involved energy, and it involved that kind of optimism that is so necessary. I think it's a mixed picture because, like other societies, democratic ones, you have elements that want stability, that want security, that don't really, they want change, but they're cautious of change. And this is, I think, also cross-generational. You have elements of the middle class in Egypt, professionals and others, that want to see democratization. Yes, they want to see free and fair elections. They want to be able to participate in the new political order. But what they speak of is, we don't want upheaval. You find shopkeepers and others that, again, we heard that they didn't mind that Tahrir was cleared of the sit-ins and the protests. So it is a mixed picture. You have elements of established political groups, such as the Muslim Brotherhood, that are, again, they're not monolithic. There are lots of opinions within that movement who feel that the battle against the military should come later. It may be forced on them to actually confront the military earlier. Depends what the military's position is going to be on the constitution and so on. So the important issue here is that those who came out and protested continue to do so. I think the agenda can be set by them. I think that every attempt is being made through military trials and other means to quell opposition. And this is what is so dangerous in Egypt today. It isn't always clear what's happening to the international community and to others. But people get arrested, they get picked up, and so on. And there is an attempt constantly to put a lid on the protests. The bottom line is, don't give in. I mean, the street is in the more powerful position, I think, because it can still twist the arm of the military. The military is, and when I say the military, I mean the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, are in a vulnerable position. They're of a generation, it's a dying generation, both in terms of age, but also in terms of mentality, in terms of its politics, and so on. And each time it felt it's cornered, it did address some of these, it made concessions. It's not an easy task to put on the activists, but the street is theirs, and it's very symbolic. The whole issue of Tahrir is very symbolic. Their right to protest, the right to assembly is a democratic right. And so long as they continue down that path, I think that they can embrace their objectives and push for them. And this is, as I think you rightly say, it is a moment. I think the moment can't be lost. There are those that want to play politics, party politics, fine. But in this situation, you do have different political actors, and they all have their role to play.
Okay, thank you. Rosemary, I think almost all the speakers have talked about the economic issues and what lies at the heart, and even from a, not even, but from an international human rights organisation's perspective as well, that is part of the human rights element in a sense. In other words, it doesn't need to be the word democracy as Brian was talking about, but the idea of dignity is clearly huge. A report that Amnesty was working on even before the protests began, before last year, came out recently, We Are Not Dirt, about forced evictions in the slums and so on. And that sense of respect and dignity that you said is clearly something which goes on. You talked earlier about the swapping of the elites. I'm interested how you see it. Do you think that the elites realise that they have lost? Do they believe that they have lost? How can that realisation and acceptance, and therefore the society moving on, how can that happen? Which is partly it may be partly a domestic question, but I'm also interested what role you think the international community, which of course dramatically looked away during the worst of the Mubarak years, again and again and again, for all those many different reasons. Do you think there's an understanding fully internationally of how great that failure was in order to gain a genuinely stable and democratic Egypt that would move forward? So lots of questions in there. Take whichever bit that you
Okay, and I said the way I like to look at these things is in terms of international politics, and I keep thinking that we may have got too riveted by examples that we can rake up from Europe over the years, including the Russian Revolution, the French Revolution, but also the Eastern European revolutions. But we may need to go to Latin America a couple of decades ago for a huge chunk of the 20th century to find the model for the dictatorships and what makes dictators tick and how they get separated from their populations. And Brian encouraged me earlier not to keep to myself this recurring recollection of a novel by Gabriel Garcia Marquez called The Autumn of the Patriarch. And there's two themes in that book which are very striking. One is that the people assume that America has taken everything. That one day they chopped up the sea and took it north to America. And there is no more sea. And whatever it is that the people want, it's gone by now because the dictator has sold out to America. And the second thing that comes out in that novel is when the patriarch finally goes, nobody believes it because they don't know life without the patriarch. And nobody knows what to believe because they've been fed with rumors, and the patriarch had doubles anyway. What is true? And my experience in going around the Middle East is that stupidly I try to explain the ins and outs of why somebody like Tony Blair would choose to do this rather than that, or what motivated Sarkozy and Cameron to go charging into Libya. And very often the reaction I get from Arab interlocutors is rubbish. It's all for the oil. And, you know, just this suspicion that they're going to be ripped off, that that's what the West is about. There is reality and there's the narrative. And I think it's completely beyond the power of Westerners to control the narrative. It already was, and now I think the Arabs have risen up and said even less so in the future. The revolution is against the dictators that you guys have kept at your convenience. And the other point that I want to make here is that I think it's in some senses really sticking my neck out here, but why not? I think the Arab revolts are a facet of the crisis of capitalism that we're experiencing in Europe. And I think it's a nonsense to assume that you can have capitalism without losers. And I think it was never the intention of the Western middle classes that the gap between the very rich and the poor masses got as vast as it did in the Middle East. But the structural changes that will have to be made will go down very poorly with the liberal capitalist governments in Europe. Because they will want to say that you have to take the pain, the poor have to take the pain in order to restructure the economy. And the rich, of course, they've got to get richer because you want to encourage them to invest and they've got to have these incentives to do business. Tried that, been there with Egypt, tried that, been there with Tunisia. I think they're going to have to come up with their own economic models as well. They have tried socialism, and they got trashed by the Europeans for making such a mess of socialism in places like Algeria and Syria and Iraq and so on, and Egypt. But I feel that that nobody's buying the idea in the region is buying the idea that more liberal capitalism, the way the Europeans do it, is the answer, unless the Europeans recognize that they've had certain advantages structurally, globally, that are going to have to be given up now.
I want to throw it open for questions, but before we do, Brian, one question picking up again on the economics, and Khalid talked about people being, again, I may be paraphrasing wrong, but as it were, ready for the economic change. Rosemary said that the structural change will go down very poorly with the liberal capitalists. The kind of economic problems that you've already addressed, which includes this massive poverty, the massive dispossessedness in so many ways, disempowered, dispossessed, do you think that the changes needed to turn all of that around? Do you think there will be the buy-in from society more generally in either of the two countries, or do you think that causes more problems?
Well, no, I don't think there will be. And, you know, we have the sort of Gamal Mubarak brand of economics, which has been thoroughly discredited. So I don't think there's going to be much tolerance for that sort of thing. But I think we shouldn't be too kind of hung up on the economics, because certainly when I was doing the research for my book, people were talking very much about their frustrations, and it wasn't just politics, it wasn't just economics. I mean, somebody in Egypt said to me, Egypt has 1 million Mubaraks. And what they meant was that the kind of style of sort of control that you see coming from Mubarak, you also find happening within families, within offices, factories, that sort of thing. I mean, it's very, that kind of authoritarianism is very ingrained. And people feel that this restricts their opportunities, restricts their freedom of choice, that sort of thing. And it's something which is, you hear a lot of resentment about, particularly from people in their late teens, early 20s. Perhaps older, they've got kind of more used to dealing with it. But I think that's a hugely important factor. And one of the things I felt, really, I think that the real revolutionary change that's happened, when I was interviewing people for the book in like 2008, there was a sense really that there's nothing we can do about it. This is the way it is. We don't like it, but what can we do? And since things happened in Tunisia, I think that has simply gone away. That there is now the idea, well, yes, actually, there are things that can be done if enough people agree to get on with it.
Which has many lessons well beyond there. Thank you very much to all of you. Throwing open to questions.
I'm Andrew Whitley, and I'm the policy director at an organisation here in London called the Elders. I have a question for the panel as a whole. What, if anything, can outsiders do, well-meaning outsiders, of course, to help move things along in a general direction that the people of the region would consider appropriate or right? There's been a troop of delegations going to Cairo recently, who were received, as I can hear, politely, but often to say thanks but no thanks, we don't need your help. And there's a rising tide of nationalism, say we can control things ourselves, we can solve things for ourselves. Now I hear about a G8 initiative which is rather ambitious to try to help support reform in a variety of different areas. How is that going to be received in the area? What can be done to avoid any mistakes that outsiders could potentially, pitfalls they could fall into?
It's a very difficult question. What can outsiders? I mean, well, first of all, I think we have to question again. We have to question, you know, along the lines of what Rosemary was saying in terms of whether outsiders are actually outsiders, or the areas in which they're outsiders and the areas in which they're not. Of course we are, and I would agree that there is a very strong relationship between what's happened in the Middle East and the crisis of capitalism, I think, world over, which I would say preceded the crisis in capitalism in terms of it being a clear crisis. And I would say that what is going on right now in the Middle East is a restructuring of discourses as well, and a restructuring of discourses that is also forcing the West to reappraise itself, not just its relationships with the region, but its relationship with many of the major items of policy decisions. There is, what I can say is this. I mean, I can't give advice as to what people from the outside should do. I mean, I think people have ideas and they try and find partners, and that works or it doesn't work. But what I can say, I can say that there is a lot, there is two things. At the moment, there is massive use of, there's massive use against activists. Activists are consistently being accused of being foreign spies or people who are funded by foreign regimes. The April the 6th movement, who's one of the major movements of political change over, and indeed a big part of the revolution. They're often credited as organising, and I don't think that's true to say at all. But anyway, I mean, they were by the army specifically singled out in one of their statements, saying that they were supported by they were supported by foreign regimes, which is of course utter nonsense. And I have seen consistently very well-meaning. Very well-meaning people coming from the West who just who literally turn up and some who turn up and say, just how can we help you? Or we want to give you this money, or we want to do this. And very often, and the difficulty, so first of all, there is the major issue that coming itself can be very unhelpful because it's used politically right now. I'm speaking again from a sort of activist perspective, but also secondly, I think there are. I don't think the West on the whole, and its NGOs, and its policymakers have yet woken up to what the revolutions in the Arab world are telling them to realise about themselves, and I think that's something that is going to take some time. And there will be a lot of refusals, and there will be, and there will be a lot of deals made. On the other hand, and I say this as someone who comes from two cultures and knows that both cultures at certain times are very suspicious of each other, and I live in between and love them both. There is a great degree of help that can be offered. But I think on an institutional basis, it's very, very complicated right now, and I don't know. I don't know when the right time is. I can't. It's very problematic.
Can I add something to this? I think that the issue of independence from the West is something that is part of a long drawn-out legacy for that part of the world. And it's being sort of reasserted again by different groups today. It's being used in different ways. The military, for example, in Egypt, SCAF, is using it, as you've suggested, to discredit the activists, to say they're recipients of United States aid and so on. It's being used in that way. And at the same time, the IMF loan, the World Bank loan, has been declined by Egypt, again as a statement of nationalist expression and independence and so on. Those active on the ground and political groupings and so on, again, want to pursue an independent path where they're not as reliant on the United States and the outside world. And yet these countries are so economically weak, and they're not going to be able to survive in isolation. They have, in order to grow, develop and prosper, they're going to have to engage in trade and so on. But the whole issue here is a more equitable relationship that's being sought. And that is exactly what others before them have tried to find in terms of, you know, even during the Egypt socialist experience under Nasser and others, the idea is to find a sort of middle path, a non-aligned path, one in which you can pick and choose. And there are elements in the, for example, the program of the Muslim Brotherhood and others, which is a bit of a mishmash. It's a bit of, you know, a bit of capitalism, a bit of socialism. I don't think that Egypt or Tunisia really know the economic path that they want to set themselves. What they know is that there are aspects of capitalism that has engendered a huge gap between the rich and the poor. They know that they've been exploited economically and otherwise by the West. But do they want to isolate themselves? I don't think that's true. Those people that I've spoken to in Egypt that are active in political parties, namely the Muslim Brotherhood, will say we would welcome help, but in very specific areas. For example, when it comes to rebuilding a completely fractured and broken down health service. We want someone to help us in technical terms to build a national insurance, health insurance policy. How do we go about that? How can we reinvigorate our health service? So there are issues related to infrastructure building. That's only one voice. I don't know how much it's shared by others. There are others that will say to you, election monitoring. Others don't want that. Certainly those in SCAF and others may not want election monitoring, international election. Others may say, well, we had some very fraudulent elections in November. There are interests, very entrenched interests from the military and other parties, whereby, of course, there may still be some sort of, tinkering with what are going to be called free and fair elections. And no, we do want international monitoring. So these questions, again, are constantly in flux, but there is room. There is room for outside help. And I think Egyptians themselves are not quite clear, and it depends who you speak to.
Thank you. For those who don't know the organisation, incidentally, Andrew Whitley's organisation, The Elders, is itself very interesting in its connection, a kind of global connectedness of elder statesmen and women, of Graça Machel, Desmond Tutu, Mary Robinson, Aung San Suu Kyi, I think, is an honorary member. So an interesting group that spreads north-south for those who don't need it. So.
Yeah. My name is Sam Abdallah, and I'm a doctor, but also I follow politics, and I was activist in the 70s.
And my father.
So just give me a minute. You see, I think there is one aspect that is really a bit not being addressed, at least deeply, in the whole debate. There was unity of all the revolutionary forces in Egypt and frankly in Tunisia as well, as far as getting off the head of the regime and getting off the regime. What replaced it was the same regime in the form of the army and so on. And then the political forces have gone into their divisions again. Okay, so you get the Islamic forces in one hand and the so-called liberal social democratic forces on the other. And therefore, and of course, the forces in the middle, be it the remnants of the old regime, which are not remnants really, they are in power, they are in government, they are in the different government bodies and other things. They want to maintain the old order. The other two forces want to changes, but these changes are confused by the nature of the state in the future. So you will find something, as far as I'm concerned, Egypt, for example, is like a piece of bread is cut into 4 bits, whereby the upper half, let us say, want democracy and whatever and so on, and the other one do not want exactly theocracy, but somehow a kind of theocratic state. Then the other half going that way want social justice, and the other part want continuum of capitalism or state capitalism or the scenario that exists. And therefore you don't have this unity between the political forces in Egypt, and you don't have a combined leadership. And the only solution in Tunisia is having exactly the same debate. The fear about the constitution, what will happen, what the Muslim Brotherhood and its allies, and remember that word, and its allies, win the election, and somehow they themselves will be marginalized and it become a kind of a more theocratic state. Is the future of Egypt is Iran? Is it, it's not going to be Afghanistan, or is it Turkey? These are debates that are going on a daily basis. Then you have the revolutionary people who are in the street, who want to effect change, who are very optimist. Yet, it's not only them that effect change, because the governing bodies, and especially the army, in my personal view, and his, are reactionary, yet they are very popular. And gaining in popularity because the whole thing is not changing. So I really believe that unless a very good debate and an effective debate between the religious forces and the liberal forces is actually engendered and encouraged to come with a formula upon which seculars and religious forces, as it were, can survive, then the future will be pretty murky. Also, there must be a situation in which the meaning of democracy, and I disagree with Brian, democracy has been a slogan throughout, but the meaning of democracy, as far as social justice is concerned, and as far as the changes that it will bring, and that it is not just a social club in which people are talking, but it is about empowerment, it's about trade unions, it's about the right to ask for change, and so on. And finally, activists, and this is where I have the criticism between me and my son in that debate, unless the whole thing is reflected in political movements, the activist will remain a force, but will not cause change. Thank you.
Unless he wants to, I won't pit you and your son against each other at this moment. But Maha, I'm interested to hear your response to some of those, including especially, we've touched on it briefly, but the secular theocratic, where we go, but also the social justice.
I have very little to disagree with there. I think the issue in Egypt of some kind of coming together of the different political forces is crucial. If you look at the vested interests that still exist in that country in relation to the military and other forces that are very entrenched, and economic interests in particular, I think it's a very important point that was raised, is that the majority in Egypt, and something I alluded to earlier, want stability. And what that means is they will react to the activism on the street by saying, well, you know, fine, they've had their protests. Egyptians will say this to you, a lot of Egyptians you speak to. They've had their protests, the young have done a good thing, fine, that's enough, well done. You know, go home now, return to your university, return to your colleges, that's it, well done. Very condescending, it's time now to, you know, take control. And this is where there is support for the military, seen as a bastion of stability. It will lead Egypt the right way. And a very sad prospect is, yes, if at the end of the day someone like Amr Moussa, who was part and parcel of the old regime, is elected. Now, I don't know if he will be or not, but that is, it undermines the whole revolutionary fervor and revolutionary struggle that we're talking about. But the weakness of Egypt in terms of challenging the regime has been the weakness of its political forces and coming together. And it's been difficult and continues to be difficult for them to come together because you're talking about religiously oriented groups and ones that have a secular agenda. However, there is room for some kind of coalition of forces, particularly between the more mainstream groups such as the Brotherhood, that I think is trying to bend backwards to show off its democratic credentials, its commitment to the democratic process, its more liberal attitude towards, believe it or not, to minorities or women and so on. The point is they are astute political players, and they're trying to play the political game very carefully. The issue here is they think that perhaps they can do it on their own. But I think what needs to be underlined is unless there is a coming together of the different political forces in Egypt, there will be a delay in creating that new society and state that many have fought for.
Okay, thank you.
My name is Rosemary Batchelor from Open Democracy, and I'd just like to hear a little bit more about the independent judiciary in Egypt, and also whether the emergency law could become the focus for a reform that could unite different parts of the people who want to see change. And could I sneak in a second question, which is, we haven't talked much about Tunisia. I was very glad to hear the statement about Egypt, that this wasn't just Tahrir Square, that it was throughout Egypt. In Tunisia, it seems to me that's more of a problem, that much of the action and the terrible carnage took place a long, long way away from the centre, in parts of Tunisia where they don't really feel as if they almost belong to the same country. And I just wondered if we could explore a little bit some of those dynamics.
Well, in preparing for today, I was looking up some of what the people who've been working on Arab reform for many years have been saying about the status of the two revolutions. And what's being said about Tunisia actually is that it has been pretty inclusive of all elements of society hitherto, but now you're getting, in view of anticipated elections for those who will decide the constitution, mutual suspicion between the Islamist party supporters and those who are exactly what Westerners used to think was so wonderful about Tunisia and so wonderful about the Tunisian revolution, because they weren't all in headscarves, they weren't all terribly traditional conservative, they sounded just like us. And so I think that's where some of the misplaced optimism from outside comes from, that, oh, they're going to be more like us. And therefore, is it misplaced pessimism about Ennahda and whatever, Islamists emerging, that they are, is it correct to say that they're actually pulling in the opposite direction? If you really did have that debate about economics, I think it would completely muddle the lines. Because I think there would be a range of opinions on economics, but at the moment nobody's running in for prospective elections on the basis of different economic platforms. So I am hopeful that, going back to the proper attitude of the outsiders and being helpful, is being learning mode. Maybe the Arabs can come up with, be they Tunisians or Egyptians, with something other than liberal capitalism or socialism, as previously tried in various forms around the world, and something that is more inclusive of the whole community in terms of their dignity.
Which is what I would say, although it's very hard, I mean, which is what I would say is happening, although it's very hard to pinpoint where it's happening right now. What is happening right now, there is a whole new set of infrastructures and relationships that is happening. And it is, in a way, to me, what is the crisis caused by what my father is talking about the fact that, as well, the kind of ideological alliances are different to the economic alliances, and that splits this the piece of bread, which I love, into lots of different quarters that don't quite match up sufficiently. a friend of mine, as this revolution happened, had a kind of great kind of statement that he said. He said that this revolution is going to take Mubarak with his opposition, which is kind of what I think it's doing. And though I agree, and this is the source of the argument, where I agree in a way that it would be better for us to be able to formulate or to allow the dust to settle, and for political people who, for parties and for the parties to be able to steer it. I believe there are completely unsteerable things happening right now, and which I believe are moving in the direction of these groupings that are going to have to take time to find out who they're complicit with, and who, and the Muslim Brotherhood is going through certain crises and will go through more. And Brian's absolutely right in a way they had an easy time of it because they didn't really have to say what they think on a policy level. But I would say that that's not just true of the Muslim Brotherhood. I would say that's true of every single political grouping and ideological political position. And so that's going, I say that that's, but underneath there's a whole load of things happening, and so it becomes really whether you believe in the process, which goes back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of the optimism, or whether you try and cut it up now, which goes back to even the formulation of the question of optimism, whether you cut it up now or whether you see the fact that a paragraph is turning into a chapter that, in relation to your question about emergency law, I would love that to be a major issue, but sadly it's not because of this issue of stability. We need emergency law because we need to put people in prison. Not that those two things are related at all.
We're good at that too now.
And also the issue with emergency law, just to address that very quickly, in a country like Egypt or elsewhere, and that was always the fear under Mubarak, is you could remove it, but you have emergency law through the back door. So you can still pick up people, you can negate it, and this could happen very easily. You remove emergency law. So you loosen up the situation, but you can still pick up the activists, you still have the military trials and so on. So in a sense, this is where again it's the issue of the rule of law is so critical and so central to this process working. And we're talking a lot about activists on the street and so on, and how the political parties are going to come together. But I think the issue of the judiciary and its independence is key in Egypt. And yes, steps in the right direction, it is going in the right direction, but still I can't speak of a completely independent judiciary just yet.
I know we've got room for one more. I know there are many more waiting. There's one who already has the microphone here. Just as a postscript to on the independence of judiciary, one of the things that I found very interesting and heartening, well, there's two small details. One, international, the fact of Tunisia having ratified the International Criminal Court. I mean, that's a major leap forward. But also, very interestingly, domestically, my understanding is that the Association of Judges there have come together wanting reform of the judiciary themselves. And of course, it comes much better from within domestically rather than anything coming from abroad. So.
Is Keith Raffin, former Member of Parliament. Just two brief points. Well, the first is on the Muslim Brotherhood. While they're not a monolith, aren't they pretty cohesive, or won't they be under the pressure of election campaign? And while they may only gain 20 to 30%, surely the crucial thing is what happens to the remaining 70 to 80% of the vote and how fragmented that is between other parties. So couldn't the Muslim Brotherhood therefore be not just influential but still actually fairly dominant? I think there's a question of whether it could be either influential or dominant. And the second point is really looking ahead in terms of development and development aid. The West is not in a position economically to do very much at the moment, but there is one country that is, and has huge resources at its disposal, as is already shown in sub-Saharan Africa, and that is of course China. And I mean, I was very interested to see in the FT today, China's initial moves in regard to Libya, for example. Obviously, I mean, maybe in terms of China it is oil, but you know, how do you see China's role? Obviously, with the declining hegemon of the United States, declining in just about every sense, you know, China actually became playing a much more active role in the Arab world.
Don't forget the Gulf Arabs.
I was just going to say Saudi Arabia, Qatar.
I was going to say, really, I would not worry too much about China. I'd be much more worried about Saudi Arabia and the Gulf Cooperation Council, because I think what they've done in Yemen under the guise of trying to help things along has been pretty terrible. I mean, really, they've helped to stymie the revolution that was beginning there. And I think there are worries that they will use their money to sort of tame revolutionary forces in other parts of the Middle East if they're given half a chance. Of course, that depends on whether their own regimes actually survive long enough to do it.
Thank you. Let's get a couple more questions in. One here, and I'll leave Millicent one, but a gentleman has the microphone already, so yeah.
It's a quick and maybe tangential question, which you may want to pass over. I'm curious about the dynamics of change in Tunisia and Egypt, on their impact on American and British attitudes. And I wonder what the impact may well have been in relation to British, Israeli and American Israeli attitudes. Is there going to be a change of the dynamic that we've seen operating for the last 20, 25 years over the concern of Israel's interests in the UK and the US? If this is tangential, move on. But
I don't think it's
I wonder if it opens up.
No, I don't think it's tangential, and I think we have at least one
I was just in the region investigating precisely that question, and I would simply say that there are now more Israelis saying, how are we going to justify depriving a population of their rights in this context, at the same time as other Israelis are saying democracy is not going to break out across the region, our neighbors are not going to become more benign, and in a dangerous situation we can't afford to be, quote unquote, giving away anything. And just in terms of the narrative, guys, I had a taxi driver that was taking me from the Sheikh Hussein Bridge to the King Hussein Bridge on the Jordan River, which means I was driving down the Jordan Valley, and he was an Israeli who spoke Arabic, and he said to me at one stage, why don't the Palestinians go back to Jordan? I thought, where do I begin? I did say, actually, they never came from there. They came from here. But then he didn't want to continue the conversation any further. So, I mean, to whatever logic surfaces, it's got to battle through a lot of different understandings of why we are where we are in that little part of the world, from which passions are derived, and in which logic, as might seem from the outside, doesn't prevail. So I see those for and against a more equitable situation for the Palestinians are getting more angry, more incensed, more frightened, and I do actually see war rather than peace.
I think we're pretty much out of time, but we do have, yeah, okay, great.
Hi, Karen McCluskey, I work for the Foreign Office. Could you comment, please, on the media landscape as you've seen it evolving, particularly in Egypt, Tunisia, if you can? Are you seeing it playing a positive role, helping to focus, helping to bring on the evolution of ideas that you mentioned, Khaled, the period of flux that we're in at the moment? And, of course, to comment on social media, we've seen it's a power in the ignition phase to destroy, to bring down government. Are you seeing any areas where it is forming positive, constructive debate and helping the market of ideas at the moment? Thank you.
Well, there are three I mean, as I'm sure you know, but the media sort of stratifies down into three main components, I would say. Obviously, you have the state media, which is still in state control, which means it's related directly to SCAF, and you have the, you have the private media, and you have the social media. I would certainly say that social media, I would say even more importantly than being part of igniting, I would say that social media's role, which it continues to have, which is extremely important, and that's part of a big part of the activity of what I've been doing over the last 4 or 5 months in the Centre Musirrin that we set up in Cairo, is in because you can't shut down the social media without shutting down the entirety of the internet. It's constantly pushing the barriers of what you can and can't say, which is in turn making the private media push the barriers of what it can and can't say, and constantly having to outdo all these new channels that have suddenly appeared. There's everyone is setting up new channels, and they're constantly having to prove that they show what's on social media, and all of these talk show hosts are bringing in activists and sort of and as a result also the state media is also having its moments in which it is having to kind of bring in people and sort of say, no, we do this too. On the other hand, I would say that's the dynamic of the landscape. And there are many different initiatives to find homes, different homes and places in which synergies synergies are made, and there's a whole host of different initiatives which I have experience of and know about or am part of creating. But on the other hand, we've seen repeatedly over the last, I would say particularly the last 2.5 months, intimidation of some of the highest, most important figures, the biggest talk show hosts, the people that everyone watches every day, who've been brought in to have tea with SCAF, who have been, and I know this on good authority, told what their red lines are. Some of whom listen to them, some of whom don't. Some of whom are given raises if they do toe the line and that kind of thing. Social people who are active in social media have been, for tweets, have been threatened with prison and have had to pay 20,000 Egyptian pounds for bail. So what is said on social media is, so the acts of there are multiple acts of intimidation. So it's a kind of, but I mean, I would certainly say that the most powerful media landscape, again, the sense of taboos, what can and can't be said, the discourse about stability, the discourse about foreign agendas, all of these kinds of things which tie into the economic, they are the kind of powerhouse that is, they're a big powerhouse. And if I sort of flip it the other way around in terms of an experience that I had, which was a very important one, which I was part of, albeit in Tahrir Square, is along with the group of people and the initiatives that I've been working with, and a lot of people who work in social media who have this huge amount of footage, we set up a sort of cinema in the square that on a nightly basis would show footage of, show raw footage, mostly, of what had happened over the last 6 months. And even in Tahrir Square, and as a result, actually, there were a number of initiatives in other squares, and even in Tahrir Square, the story that was being told was one that people felt that they, that they hadn't had the opportunity to even to claim, forget reclaim, even to claim. Whether that's about what the violence was like, the people who died, what these major incidents of clearings or accusations of torture, there are major red lines, and and a lot of them concern the army. So, the battle for a consensus, the battle for a discourse which is not, oh, we had 18 days, the revolution's over, yalla, everyone to bed. the battle against that is almost more is just as important as the battle to be able to say things about torture and human rights abuse, because actually what the state media or the stability discourse is doing, so I didn't mean you're the stability discourse, I just meant, but what the stability discourse is doing is it's sort of shutting down on the sense of, come on, we need to get back and get our heads down. So,
thank you. Yeah.
Okay, my name is Guido. I've got business interest in Tunisia. You have spoken about to be optimistic. I would like to be pessimistic for a little while. What could be the worst scenario if things do not go well, especially in Tunisia? And thank you very much already for your answer. It's been clear?
We'd like to take that. Brian, everyone's looking away from the pessimism question. I know. I mean, you were keen to talk, especially on Egypt, but I'm happy to take. Yeah.
I suppose Leila Trabelsi would come back and run the country. President Ben Ali's wife.
I want to take the question in a different sense, which ties together the last three questions. So sorry, I don't know if I've spoken too much, but. I mean, in the sense as well that I don't feel like I can talk. It's not that I feel like I can talk about Tunisia, but I want to frame, in a way, our response as, because I think there's a level of discomfort about talking broadly about Tunisia, and which goes to the question about Israel, which I think is one of the key questions and also about what I'm saying is the extent to which we're talking about, we have to talk about things with a sense of extreme locality, or whether we can actually talk about them with a kind of broadness. And if I put it this way around, the fact that we have seen these revolutions take place in so many different places out of a joint spirit, albeit different contexts, I would say there is a way in which we can talk about those experiences in a similar vein. I would say definitely from your perspective, the worst thing that can happen is that, I don't know what your business interests are, but the worst thing that can happen is that you lose all your money. And I would say as your business interest, it's probably kind of, the next 5 years are probably important for you, and I would say the next 5 years are going to be complicated. But yes, I mean, I think this broadness.
Doesn't it go back to what you said about you've got to be optimistic and it's got to be infectious, otherwise you'll never get anywhere. And I suggest what you do is you get some other businessmen and you get as many Tunisian partners as you can and you create your own momentum. Because if it's you by yourself, you're more likely to lose your money than if you can get an optimistic momentum.
I think over the next 5-10 years we're going to see an explosion. We're already seeing it, an explosion of creativity across the Middle East, in all of the countries. I'm not, I'm not at all. I don't want to encourage. I'm not encouraging kind of. I want to encourage collaborations, but the model very much has to be from the Middle East up. It's not from the outside in, at all. And I would say, from a business perspective, which goes for everything, for politically, in other words, it's not. Listen to the people there, and they are the ones who will. If business is in any way related to stability, the stability is in them because that's what they want. That's what they will create in their future over the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And that is across the region. It is fundamentally across the region. And the big question, which is not being, because it's still a taboo in all, well, it's not a taboo in the Middle East, but it's still a massive taboo, here and in the West on the whole, is this issue of Israel and how we can and can't talk about it. And it, whatever the level of the discourse, when I think about what British foreign policy should be doing or American foreign policy should be doing and all of these kinds of things, until it deals with the issue of Israel in a way that the Middle East accepts, there's always going to be a double standard, there's always going to be a hypocrisy in terms of how one views the other. And that's not going to change.
I think there are two...
Where we're badly out of time. I want to hear from you, but it needs to be very brief. Yeah.
All right. I think there is a polarization of interests here, particularly in the economic sphere and also in the political. you have people waiting in the wings to make investments in these parts of the world that are very much part of the old exploitative interests from outside and also from inside. So, you know, the big tourism projects, etc., etc. I mean, you know, whether from the Gulf or Europeans trying to come in, obviously, to build up the coast in Libya at some stage and so on. So I don't think that we can, in some ways...
Can we find out what Guido intends?
Yes. No, but I mean, I think the issue...
What is your business?
I think that the issue here, it's not about small businesses only. It's not only about small businesses and creativity, I think definitely, but we've got much bigger powers at play here. And the issue here is how you deal with the corruption that has existed for so long and the exploitation that has existed. And hopefully the democratic process, if it gets underway, will prove something of a check on that kind of corruption. Just a very quick word on Arab Israel, if I may. I think in the same way that we forced change in the region, in Egypt and Tunisia, and it's underway in Syria now, and I think Syria is key. And it is infectious, and I don't think it's going to stop in Syria. I think that was forced on the West and on the leaders and society of that part of the world. In the same way, the issue of Palestine and the change that needs to be made there in terms of the right of return and the right of Palestinians, not just to two states, I believe the importance here is of equal rights within one state is going to have to happen from within. We can't wait for the United States or any outside power to intervene. In the same way that change was brought about from people rising in Egypt and Tunisia and today in Syria, change when it comes to Palestine and Palestinian rights is going to have to be initiated from within.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm afraid we can't, although I think our speakers are still here, the conversation I'm sure can continue. Thank you very much indeed. A fascinating and important conversation. And I think our speakers are still here, happy to continue talking. And in the meantime, many thanks to all of you and thanks for your questions.